Hello, everyone in the room and on Zoom. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much.
Most people experienced this last month with me, so I have, I guess, partners in crime in this now. So welcome to the December 2022 Legacies and Lunch, a hybrid program of the Butler Center for Arkansas Studies. I'm Heather Register-Zabindon, the Programs and Website Coordinator for the Roberts Library. I'm going to skip a lot of my regular introductions since we are kind of behind time. So I'm going to scroll up real quick to get to the Randy part, to get to Randy's part of it. Okay, so if you do have questions, you can type them into the chat on Zoom, or obviously you can ask them here at the end of the program. So this month we are joined by Randy Duncan to talk about the power of comics, of the comics art form. Randy is the Ellis College Distinguished Professor of Communication and the Director of the Center of Comic Studies at Henderson State University. He has given talks about comics from New York to Prague, São Paulo to Belfast. There was a lot of other cities in there. I just kind of cut it down. He is the co-editor of the Eisner-nominated Critical Approaches to Comics Theories and Methods, as well as the companion volume, More Critical Approaches to Comics. In 1992, Duncan co-founded the Comics Arts Conference, the first U.S. academic conference devoted to comics. So, Randy, thank you for your patience. Thank you for being here on this rainy day, and I'm going to let you take it away.
Well, thank you, Heather, for that introduction. Thanks for everyone being here. Obviously, I'm going to be talking about Illustrated Arkansas, the Art of Comics, which is the exhibition that is downstairs in the underground gallery here at the Roberts Library building. But you can't imagine how excited I was, even though I knew it was going to happen, how excited I was when I walked down there and I actually saw comics art on the walls. I've been reading comics, specifically comic books and some comic strips, since I was 8 years old. And I was a lucky person that I was born at the right time, that comics grew up as I grew up. As my taste got a little bit more sophisticated, so did comics. The second, third generation of comic creators went into it as something that they considered their life's work, their art form, and they had ambitions to do more with it than just simply entertain 11-year-old boys, which is kind of what comics began as in the late 30s and the 40s. And they're very different sorts of things now. There's comics for everyone. In addition to reading comics, I've spent a lot of time teaching comics and writing about comics. And for the last 36 years, I've done that in Arkansas at Henderson State University. And being at Henderson State and traveling around the state and being at local cons, I've met an awful lot of talented artists in this state who create comics. And so I really thought we should have some way to showcase that, to let people know about that aspect. Let's see if that may not advance. I may have to use the.
Here.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay.
Now it's your.
So some of those Arkansas-born artists have received international acclaim, such as Nate Powell for the March series that got the National Book Award. Others have a pretty strong national following, such as Dusty Higgins, who does the artwork for the Pinocchio Vampire Slayer series of graphic novels, which is a pretty inspired idea. Pinocchio tells us a lie, his nose grows, he snaps it off, and he kills vampires with it. And then just tells another lie when he needs another wooden stake. I don't know how people didn't think of that before. But there's others that haven't been recognized that widely for their work, and they really should be, for beautiful artwork, for creative work in a variety of genres, for imaginative takes on local mythology, or interstellar possibilities. And so one of the things that I've been able to do in my time at Henderson State University is finally, after years of teaching the comics, get a Center for Comic Studies. And the Center for Comic Studies was officially inaugurated in 2019. That fall, we found out the university was 20 million in debt. Then COVID came in the spring, and things have gone a bit downhill. So we had a few projects we had started of working with local schools on creating local history comics, of gathering some oral history of comics fandom in Arkansas. Those projects are kind of aborted. If you follow the news, you know that Henderson has been evolving to something different. And pretty much the arts and humanities programs were eliminated. So I'm on my last year in a terminal contract, and I don't think there's going to be a Center for Comic Studies going forward. So kind of the last hurrah for the center is that exhibition that's downstairs. That I'm so glad that Colin Thompson was receptive when I pitched that idea as a possibility. Okay. And it's nice to see that to come to fruition. While I'm still there at Henderson, and who knows what the next phase is. But right now, I'm kind of proud that we could call attention to these artists. And a lot of what I've done in my own work is look at the comics form. So what I want to talk about today is how you can better appreciate that exhibition by giving you a little bit of what to look at beyond just, that's a nice drawing here. So in this page by Tanya Wooten, we have what actually a French theorist first called in I'm not going to say it in French, but translates into the waffle iron grid. That's kind of the typical way of laying out a comics page. So in the early days of comics in the late 30s and the 40s, they tended to do just like 3 tiers of 3 panels and a 9-panel layout. It was the basic sort of thing. But it's good to know that that grid is kind of like a underlying structure, even if you don't see it. And it's the comics creator is always making some choices about how to vary from that grid. All right. So some of the terminology that applies to movies can be applied to comics, sometimes directly, sometimes more metaphorically. And so, for example, in film, we talk about an establishing shot that says, here's the location we're in. And so when there's a change of scene, a change of location in a comic, you often have that sort of establishing shot. And so we get that here. There's a young girl walking through the woods. So we get a longer shot of the woods. All right. But notice how each tier, how each row of panels across kind of operate as a segment within the overall page. So just walking through the forest in the first tier, and the second tier, we see on the left panel, she's obviously seeing something. We don't see what it is. In film, we would call that an eye line match kind of cut, where we cut to what somebody's looking at. Obviously on comics, we see it all at once. We know it's an elephant. But we sort of have to ignore the elephant in the room. And so there's this kind of discipline to reading comics of, even though you know what's going to happen at the end of the page, then you kind of go back and you concentrate on one panel at a time and unfold the story. All right. And then the third tier, she's interacting with the elephant. And the fourth tier, she tells it goodbye. So we have kind of a complete little story here that Tanya has created with some beautiful artwork, some digital artwork that kind of shows us how you can use that waffle iron grid. Here's one that looks like it has only 2 different panels. Now, what a panel is a pretty flexible concept, but I think always a discernible concept. Even if there's not borders around the panel, like there's not at the top of the page, we recognize it's kind of acting as one panel. But arguably, taken in the context of this story, there's 3 tiers there, because on that middle of the page, those 4 people are one family, and they're the family that the story is about. So even though we get 2/3 of the page establishing a location at an airport, and it's large because it's a spacious area, we kind of get an invisible second panel there that's just the family. And then we get a bordered panel that forces us to focus on the girls. And you get something that in early days of film would have been a violation of filmmaking, where they said, don't violate the 180-degree rule. If you're seeing something from this side, you can't suddenly be seeing it from that side. It disorients the audience. They totally violate that all the time nowadays. But here it kind of forces us to then, like we zoomed in on the other side on the girls and are focusing on them. So here again, something that looks like, and that was also Tanya Wooten's panel. This is Fisher Lee page. So movies will do this too, where when we cut to a new scene, we don't immediately get the long shot of the establishing panel, we get a close-up of something. And that makes us go, what the heck is that? Where are we now? And then you go from that thing you focus on closely to pull back. And that's kind of what we have here. We have focusing on the alarm clock. Now, there's other ways you could have done that. If you wanted to emphasize that the alarm clock was really loud and startling, it could have been a large panel and the bring, very large and going over to the next panel. But here, just a normal alarm clock. And again, notice how these 4 tiers operate as separate, distinct components. The waking up tier, the frantically getting ready. So those are smaller panels that she's getting ready than the waking up, because when we wake up, it's a gradual sort of thing. It takes a little time. And then the having breakfast panels. And then the last panel is the width of the page, because we moved from the house to outside. So we just feel a sense of openness with the wider panel. Also, she's running. So having it wider gives a sense of motion. We see space behind her, we see space in front of her. So depicting motion in comics is one of those tricky sorts of things. And for anything to work in comics, the readers have to be engaged and involved. That's why when I teach people who don't really read comics, but they're English majors and they do a lot of reading, I have to tell them, slow down and look at the pictures. Because what they do is they go from caption to word balloon to caption, and they read the words, and they never made the girl run. but a comics reader makes her run because they're used to reading comics, and they imagine that space behind her she came from, they imagine the space in front of her she's going to run to. So comics reading, sometimes, it doesn't take long to read an adventure comic or superhero comic, but to get the most out of it, you have to kind of slow down a little bit. You have to kind of appreciate the choices that a creator made on something. So this is one by Dusty Higgins. That's not actually, I don't think, it may be in the slideshow that's projected, but not on the wall. I like this one because it shows some of the creativity you can do with the comics page. There's a simultaneity of perspectives here. So we are looking down on a boy who's waking up. And he's a real live boy who used to be a wooden boy. So this is farther in the series of Pinocchio graphic novels in which he becomes a real live boy. And that's, I know you can't tell those tiny panels, that's a ghost of a cricket on his shoulder. That's the ghost of Jiminy Cricket. So we're looking down on him as he wakes up and opens his eyes, but then we're simultaneously seeing in the background the tree that he sees above him and the sun coming through it. So you can do things like that with the comics page, and it kind of in the background gives us a context for the establishing. And then we go to the wider one of the beach, and we see, okay, he's woken up on a beach, and so we know he's washed up on that beach if we've been reading the graphic novel on it. And sometimes you have panels like that one on the bottom left, where you're going to have a lot of dialogue. So you do a long shot where the figure is small, because we've established what the figure looks like already. We established the face, and so now you have space for your words around that. And so one of the things that comics creators have to do is figure out how to blend words and pictures properly. And some people overwrite; they put more words than need to be, and they don't let the pictures tell enough storytelling. But there's some things where you've got complex ideas to explain, or if it's a comic there's a mystery being solved, but you have to have lots of time where the detective's thinking out loud or talking to their sidekick, explaining to John Watson, how their deductions worked. So you try to find ways that make that not so boring in presenting those. Did that? I came back. So superhero comics have different conventions. One of the things you may notice here is suddenly bright colors, because that's one of the conventions. And also we expect more action. Although no one actually gets hit on this page, there's the potential for that. So here, again, we start off before we establish the background with an inset panel. It's inset in the establishing shot of the location, but it creates some action to catch our attention. And so then we have to figure out that root beer bottle probably got knocked over by this confrontation that's happening at the little stand there. I believe, anybody know why that stand might be named Kapow? Two reasons. It's a sound effect that occurs a good bit in comics, in superhero comics, and there's also an area comic book store, Kapow Comics. And so since we're talking about things created by Arkansans and local folks here, I don't know why that goes out sometimes, but
Yeah, it really wants to take a nap. Let me see.
that's probably happening because I talk too long on each panel. It's sort of when my students start looking at their phones that I go, okay, I stayed too long on that point.
Okay, I think that'll actually do it.
Okay. But this computer is more impatient than my students. So we are subtly introduced to our hero because if you read the stories, that's his dog that wears that red kerchief. That's his boot coming in. But then we have this confrontation where the poor little guy is going to get punched by this big muscle man until the hero grabs his wrist in the bottom right-hand panel. So this is kind of an example of a page working as a distinct unit, because we've got like a whole little story here, don't we? It's kind of like the elephant story. And even though this is not a self-contained story, there's more of the comic after this and before. You often have pages working like this. And you often have the bottom right-hand panel working as a cliffhanger panel that makes you wonder, okay, what's going to happen next? The incentive to turn the page. Are these two guys going to fight? What's going to happen here? Oh, and I forgot to say that's artwork by Mitch Breitweiser and wonderful color by Elizabeth Breitweiser. And they also have a publishing company, Allegiance Comics, that publishes this particular comic. And Elizabeth Breitweiser is one of the more critically acclaimed colorists in the comic book industry. Yeah. There's this book that anyone who likes old Hollywood, I'm off on a tangent here, anyone likes old Hollywood and mystery kinds of stories should read, called The Fade Out, that she colors. And it's worth just flipping through the book for the coloring. It's also a good story by Ed Brubaker, but it's colored by an Arkansan. So this is a Gustav Carlson page from, and this one is on the wall. So I was going to say, this is something that's in the exhibit. And if I recall, there's also the pages that show the process before he has the coloring in here. So there don't seem to be panel borders across that top tier, but it's obviously more than one panel. And one thing that tells us that we have a new panel is the same character appears again. So one character appears 3 times, but our main character appears 4 times. So we sort of have 4 panels, but it doesn't really matter because what it's showing is she's moving much faster than he is. She's actively jumping from tree to tree. Now, this is a story in which he might actually be the moon. This fellow might be. He says he's the moon. He says he fell out of the sky. And she's worried about getting him back up in the sky. And there's twice when he takes a drink on this page. And what happens? He lights up. And what he's drinking is moonshine, because in that bottom panel, she asks on the bottom, what's that? And then he drinks, and then he says, it makes the moonshine. So we can take it as just a guy who's kind of getting drunker as he drinks the moonshine, or we can take it as it's literally what makes the moonshine, if that's who he is. So one thing I like about this is that it's an unconventional size, and that Gustav does his things more oblong than regular comic book size. And when you choose the shape of your pages, that's going to influence the way you lay them out and the way you tell the story and the pacing of it. Also just love his artwork because it's kind of in between, hyper realistic and really cartoony, and it's got a distinctive style, even down to the ways he does the texturing of trees and whatnot. So one of the things about rereading a comic after you've read it is going back and looking at those little things that are kind of so important about an artist, that are distinctive to them. An aside here about about a comics historian who was our Kansan, who we lost a few years back, Hames Ware, who was an art detective back before comics had credits in them. He recognized different art styles. He got in touch with different artists. He tracked down who did what. He, along with Jerry Bales, put together the who's who in American comics in the early 70s to kind of give credit to people who weren't getting credit. So it's the kind of things that Hames, it makes me think of him when I see distinctive art style that, he would go, oh, that squiggle that someone does for a tree, or the way they draw leaves, it means it's this artist. So this is a page by Nate Powell. And this is, 4 tiers. And again, we got establishing shot here on the Arkansas River. But what's interesting about this one is his choices that kind of create tension. I don't know how well you can tell on the 3rd tier, those 3 panels. He's telling a story about his father who worked on the river, who reported some fellow workers for stealing. The boss he reported to was in on it. They tried to kill him. His arm was crushed by a barge. He lost the arm, lost his job, was a broken man the rest of his life. So that's the story that's being told. And as he's telling this, the man who's talking about his father picks up this stone, and it's kind of like if we see a gun in a movie, we're just waiting for when that gun's going to be used, and then he looks at the stone in his hand as he's talking. And so what he does, I don't have the next page because it's not in the gallery, but then he throws it in anger at the river on it. And so Nate has done a good job, I think, of kind of creating that, like, what's the deal with the stone? And we get kind of a mounting emotion and frustration from him as he's telling the story about his father. We also have this figure in the background that's drawn in a very different style. The main character here, this detective, is drawn with a good bit of detail. That other character is just sort of an outline, isn't he? And no color to him. So I'll give away something that if you read the book, Two Dead, you find out pretty early on, he's not really there. This guy thinks he's talking to someone, but it's his schizophrenia. And so we have a figure who's not really there, and this is a way of representing that. So every choice that's made is made with a purpose. The artist starts with a blank screen, maybe, because a lot of them do it digitally now, or a blank Bristol board for those who still work on that. And with a good creator, nothing's there by accident. Everything had a reason as to why they wanted to do it that way. Here's another one by Nate Powell. That again starts with a startling moment to get our attention, and then we see the setting for it. We have around that character's head what we call emanata, things emanating. And so that's used a lot in manga, in Japanese manga, to show surprise or tension or action that's going to happen. And so we see more influence of manga because Nate's fairly young and grew up at a time when manga was really more popular than American comics with a lot of young people. If you remember the days when Barnes and Noble had a huge manga section and just a little graphic novel section. Yeah, Nate sort of grew up in that period. But then we have the confrontation set up in the next panel with the pointing finger that leads us to the figure he's pointing at, John Lewis, and then the billowing jacket behind him, again, giving that sense of movement. And so he's like we're propelling that character toward the other character, and then they get face to face, and then we get the panels that kind of zoom in on them, to use a film term for that. You'll notice also here, the word balloons are different. So the sheriff's word balloon, that first one's got some jagged parts to it as he's yelling. Maybe lots of emotion in his voice in the way that it's wavery. But John Lewis's reply, word balloons are just normal, just resolute, calm. So what we get from this is a sense of tone of voice. And so that can also be done with lettering. We see that a little bit, obviously, with the yelling being louder, but there are some letterers, that's their job. They letter comics, and they're very good at communicating particular emotions through the lettering. So if you're really engaged in reading a comic, you can hear the way people are speaking. You're kind of doing the acting for them to some extent, but really drawing, lettering, coloring are kind of all part of acting for comics. It's how we see the things happening from that. So that's a fairly creative page with his use of space and the zooming in. This one's extremely creative. There's 4 pieces in the show from David Orr, who's currently a Master of Liberal Arts graduate student at Henderson. And this is a part of his master's thesis project. And he has had panels from this graphic novel that he's working on in a gallery in LA that was looking at avant-garde art, and another gallery in New York City. So pretty much we can say, you can see David Orr's work in LA, New York, and Little Rock. Yeah. So that's kind of a nice combination to have. You kind of can recognize the basic characters, but they morph. Sometimes characters merge together, characters duplicate. It's very surrealistic, but at the same time, there's an internal consistent logic to it, sort of a metaphorical logic, but in context, things make sense. It's about a bus ride he took from Arkadelphia to Hot Springs at the same time that people were heading to Washington for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, the event at which Martin Luther King Jr. gave the famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And he's the only white person on the bus, this little, I forget if he's 9, 10 years old boy who's going to Hot Springs. That's as far as he's going, but the bus is going on up north. And so he's kind of talking about that experience. And then he and one of the kids on the bus end up performing in a nightclub in Hot Springs. That didn't really happen. They didn't really meet Jerry Van Dyke that we see here. So it's a fanciful story that's kind of his perspective on race relations as a kid, and also kind of a story about his relationship with a mother who figures into it and sometimes turns into a tornado. So there's really no limits to what you can do with comics. Now, David's kind of pushing the boundaries, and maybe people wouldn't consider his work comics, but that's clearly kind of what he was trying to do, was to work within the comics form in a very creative way. So if you'd like to have more in-depth and maybe a little bit more technical language to go with understanding how comics work and understanding the comics form, you have to wait till October of next year for the 3rd edition of The Power of Comics, which now has a subtitle and graphic novels, because Bloomsbury said, come on, everyone calls them graphic novels. What they aren't always, but anyway, there's a still perfectly acceptable 2nd edition that's bouncing around that you can get cheap. It's a little bit more accessible than lots of comic scholarship because we did it as a textbook to be used in classes. So it's kind of written for people who maybe have no background in comics. And there's a section of it that's just about comics form, where I wrote a whole bunch of stuff that my co-authors made me cut about 2/3 of. So that's why I do these talks, so I can get those things out that I couldn't get in the book. But most important is the art itself. And so I hope you will see the exhibition. If you've seen it, which many people sitting here live today have, I hope you'll see it again and think about some of these things I talked about. And maybe buy some of the books by these folks. So I'm just going to show you a couple of examples of ones that are set in Arkansas. And these two are easy to find because one's by Nate Powell and one's by Sean Fitzgibbon, who just recently got a Arkansas Arts Council grant for this work. And so it's for sale in a number of places around town. A little bit harder to find. Eva the Ozarks is Gustav Carlson's book that I was showing you about the one about the moon that fell to Earth. Now, Bass Reeves is published by Allegiance Arts, which is Arkansas-based publishing company. I don't know that the creators on this were necessarily Arkansans, but if you know the history of Bass Reeves, born in Arkansas, an escaped slave who then became a farmer in Van Buren, and then became a deputy U.S. Marshal working out of Fort Smith. So it's about an Arkansan and Arkansas-based stories for the most part. So for those at home who haven't seen the exhibition, on a day when it's better weather than it is today, take a drive to Little Rock. I think you'll be surprised at the talent you see on display there from Arkansans. And hopefully I've given you some things to think about today about how to appreciate that work a little bit more. So thank you for having me.
Well, thank you so much. You can stay there. Okay. We do have a few questions. Travis Langley, well, I guess a comment. Travis Langley says a fine book. I kind of wondered maybe if he was one of your co-authors.
No, but he's a colleague at Henderson. And in response, I should say that Travis Langley's book about Batman and psychology is also a fine book. So Travis is a Arkansan, and he has used not only comics characters, but lots of pop culture characters to teach about psychology. So I'm glad he made that comment because it reminded me that in the gallery, in an alcove that most people don't look at, there's a laptop that has a slideshow going that talks about some of the comic scholars in the state, including sitting right here in the room with us, the world's leading expert on Classics Illustrated, Bill Jones Jr. And there's a display case with some of those books. But that display not only talks about scholars like Haynes Ware that I mentioned and Michael Barrier, but some of the local publishers.
And I think that Crescent Hotel, Sean Fitzgibbon's book is for sale in the bookstore here as well. And I'll put in a plug, he did Legacies and Lunch a year ago for us in October, and it was fabulous. It was so interesting. So we have another question on Zoom, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. Blanton Matthews, maybe, who drew the cover of the upcoming 3rd edition?
Sonny Liu, who's an Eisner Award winning artist, drew the cover. And it's based on this sort of experimental comic that takes the same spaces and shows them at different time periods. And so he kind of played on that to show different genres of comics that are represented on there. I don't know how much he'll end up getting paid. It's a pittance, but we only got him to do it because one of our co-authors, starting with the 2nd edition, is Paul Levitz. And Paul Levitz started at DC Comics when he was 17 years old, doing their in-house newsletter for them, and rose to being president and publisher of DC Comics. So he kind of helps us out with the comics history part of the book, and he knows everybody in the industry. And so he wrote a book called Dr. Fate, and Sonny Liu did the art for it when Sonny was breaking in. And so he said, "Hey, Sonny, can you do this for about 1/20th of your usual fee?" And so there you go. Good to know Paul Levitz.
So I have a quick question for myself, and I don't know a lot about comics, but you hear comics and you hear cartoons. What's the difference?
Well, usually a cartoon refers to something animated. And so there's a boundary there that's hard to define because there are motion comics. But I think if they move too much, it's a movie. It's no longer a comic. But cartoon also refers to editorial cartoons, which are kind of not comics because they're just one panel. So usually I define comics as something that has multiple panels. So there's comic strips, there's comic books, and there's graphic novels. Yeah. So a few panels, a good many panels, and a whole bunch of panels. That's your 3 categories of comics.
Okay, good, good. Jeff?
So what would you call like a single panel, like I don't know, family circus?
That one's often used as an argument because family circus will have a dotted line sometimes showing people went here and did this, they went here and did that. So there's like a little narrative or story that you can follow in it. It comes down to it. Definitions aren't that important. It's, you know, did the cartoonist do a good job communicating something? Do you like it? The first comic strip in America was The Yellow Kid, which was a one panel. And it was always just one panel, but there was a whole lot of kids in it doing a whole lot of different things. So it was kind of like with Family Circus and lots of action. So even though it wasn't really a strip of panels, you know, we still sort of historically refer to it as a panel strip. And so I don't know if anyone knows who Scott McCloud is. I know some of the audience members, like Blanton and Travis, know. So he wrote a book called Understanding Comics that we sort of compete with the power of comics, but it's hard to compete with it because he's Scott McCloud and he's brilliant, and he did it in comics form. He drew it, explaining comics theory. So anyway, we're at the very first ever Comics Arts Conference back in 1992, and he hadn't yet published Understanding Comics, and so it was like someone who was going to be there said, I know this guy is doing a comics theory book, can you do a slideshow from it? So we got to see a slideshow from Understanding Comics before it was published, and before we realized who Scott McCloud was. But I knew who Bob Harvey was, R.C. Harvey, who had been writing about comics for years. So he and Scott got into this argument about, can there be a one panel comic? So, and that was at the opening reception on registration night. And the next day, Bob Harvey comes back and he's drawn this one panel thing. He draws very PC curvy women. He drew this woman, and then there was there were like soda bottles that were exploding or something as she walked past. So there's bottles here that haven't exploded. She's here, and these bottles have exploded. So he said, see, obviously things have happened. She's moved and the bottles have exploded. How is that not a comic? And I forget Scott's response. It was probably long and erudite, but but it's fun for comic scholars to argue about those things, but for the audience, it doesn't really matter.
Really interested comics history in the evolution of Bristol. And I have an artist friend, John Snyder, who did a couple of the news lessons illustrated. He did Joseph Conrad's Secret Agent, and then a spectacular about Czechoslovakian life. He's still very active. He's only in his early 40s. But he still works on paper, on Bristol. I've seen photographs of him that were the drawings in the different stages. He sent me some, initial illustration sketches and completed work. Is that a rarity now? We more artists work with computer screen.
It's kind of directly related to age. Probably the younger they are, the more likely they are to be doing everything digitally. And that's because some things have come out, like the Syntec tablet that's designed specifically for artists, which kind of like having all those Photoshop options available to you quickly with buttons on it. But they're still drawing with a pen, on that screen. But I think maybe the thing that happens, I don't have any statistics on this, but maybe most common is working on a Bristol board to an extent and then scanning it and then completing the work digitally. Because a lot of artists still like that. If they ever started with a Bristol board, they just kind of still like that feel, of the drawing that way. but sometimes they will do just what we call thumbnail sketches, just kind of rough layouts on that, and then they'll scan it and they'll really refine it in the digital. And so most coloring is digital coloring, most lettering is digital lettering. And so letterers, what they do is they'll create a number of different distinctive fonts that they have a copyright on, and then they just apply them. Yeah. So I think the Bristol board will become more and more rare, unfortunately. It's still the thing is, you can sell the Bristol board if you're an artist. Right. And so it seems a little short-sighted on the part of artists to totally work digitally because the artists who have Bristol boards and become well-known and have fan followings can get $5,000, $6,000, $10,000 or sometimes more for that original art. But
so bringing up the library, this idea that paper books are going to be lost art, and of course we found that that's the opposite of true. Ebooks and audiobooks and all the new venues just brought more readers into the fold. Do you think that living in the age where we have all of these, like, we see in Marvel and Stanley as like movies and TV shows, is that bringing two new comic book fans, or did that take away from that fandom?
I don't think it's bringing people to reading the comics the way the comics companies thought it would, but I think the comics companies don't care. So what I mean by that is that Marvel and DC are part of huge corporate conglomerates that would just as soon not do comics. So one reason that Paul Levitz was no longer president and publisher of DC Comics is that Disney bought Marvel. There's these successful movies, and the powers that be at Warner Brothers and whoever owned them at that time. It's hard to keep up. It was AT&T recently, and then Discovery, I think, next. But anyway, whoever the corporate parents are, they felt like he cared too much about the comic books, even though he felt like he was spending too much of his time getting on a plane and flying out to LA, having to talk about developing these things into something else, because he really did care about the comic books. And so they put in someone who was a movie merchandising person in his place. So they see them only as IP, only as intellectual properties. And it's good to keep the comics going because you develop new characters and new IP. So, you know, the Ms. Marvel character that there was a streaming show about and will be in the new Marvels movie, you know, wouldn't have existed if they did LA Comics before that time, maybe. You know, G. Willow Wilson might not have created her. But they don't really care if they sell a lot of copies, I don't think, or if there's a lot, if they increase readers. And frankly, I am reading more and more on my iPad, partly because I have too many comics in my house. And if I ever move, like, what am I going to do? So I don't need to buy more. But it's also cheaper. I pay $69, $79 a year, you know, because comics are $4 a piece. But I hope the print ones never go away. And I'm really gratified that my students who are really into comics prefer to read print comics most of the time. And you know, they've been talking about the demise of books and the demise of comics for decades and decades and decades now, and it's just not happening. But it's not because the companies care.
I think it's probably like the turntable. Like, we all got rid of our, well, some of us got rid of our turntables. And Paul's on, no, I didn't. But some of us got rid of our turntables, and now we're buying turntables again and vinyl. I mean, we kept vinyl.
Yeah.
But yeah. So, okay, one question on video, and then I have a quick question, and then we'll wrap it up. Is there anything specific that distinguishes comics from graphic novels aside from the number of panels?
That's about it. I mean, graphic novels I see as a subset of comics. Like I said, comic strips, comic books, graphic novels. most famous graphic novel is Mouse by Art Spiegelman. And some of you have probably read that in the book club or something, because and it won a special Pulitzer Prize for literature. And so Art Spiegelman has written about comics theory, and he used to really get aggravated about people calling just anything a graphic novel. He'd go, that's not a graphic novel, that's a comic book. And then it got to be where one time one editor asked him for a one-page comic for some magazine. And he said, hey, can you do a graphic novel for us on, and he said, a graphic novel, how long you can have? And he said, well, it's just one page. And Art goes into a fury about this. And then he decides, oh, to hell with it. Call everything you want to a graphic novel. And so he decided that in some ways a graphic novel is about the ambition that's behind it. You know, did you mean to create something special and enduring and it has something to say? And, you know, if you did it in one page, then fine, call it a graphic novel if you want to. So I think he is saying graphic novels are considered more serious than comics, but there's a lot of graphic novels that aren't that serious. And there's a lot of 22-page comic books that are pretty good pieces of literature. So there's no clear dividing line.
Okay, so final question, DC or Marvel?
Well, I am contractually obligated to, so back in 2014, I forget when it was, got approached about being a co-curator on this Marvel exhibition, which is still traveling the country. It's in Portland right now. And it's a big thing that millions of dollars are put into. To give you an idea of how much money, Hans Zimmer, who does the movie scores for a lot of movies, Dunkirk and the Batman movies, his studio did the soundscape, just the music you hear incidentally in the background as you're going through the exhibition. And so one time the head of the exhibition company sent out to all of us on the team a video of the orchestra performing. He said, hey, the orchestra is recording our soundscape. I'm like, oh my God. I didn't get paid nearly that much, but I do get a little bit of money every time it goes to a new city, since I was one of the co-curators. And even if it weren't for that, I'm not really contractually obligated, but if it weren't for that, Marvel does such a better job with the movies that I got to lean to them on that end.